Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies, the podcast that asks, what is Britishness? Over the last few weeks and months, I've been focusing on some kind of pop culture here in the UK, James Bond, Doctor Who, more on that. Doctor Who coming, because of course we're in the 60th anniversary year, coming up to the anniversary itself in late November. But I thought I'd have a look at the local news stories once again. I am right now in my sitting room in rural West Yorkshire, going through the local newspapers, because we are in what is popularly known as the silly season. The silly season is so called because Parliament is in recess for much the same historical reasons as schools having school holidays. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that no work is being done. MPs, like other jobs, have good ones and bad ones. The good ones will use this time to get in touch with their constituency. So much of the year, they're all based in Westminster discussing all the laws that they're creating, the civil service that they oversee, the institutions they're responsible for. But people complain that they get too out of touch. They live in some kind of Westminster bubble away from us all. So this is a really key time where they can start to reconnect with their constituents. They go back to the shires, or they come back to the shires, and start to talk to real people about real things. That's what the good ones will do. Can't speak for all of them. I don't know if it's the few that I've come across are the few good apples that give the majority a good name they don't deserve. But we are also just past the party conference season. How did that go? I don't know if this is reported internationally, I suspect not. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, went to Manchester to talk to the Conservative Party conference. So they're the gathering of all the MPs, party members, and of course you have all the journalists there listening, as Rishi Sunak in Manchester announced that HS2, the high-speed rail link that's supposed to go up and down the country, will not go to Manchester. I thought very impressive. Announced that policy in Manchester itself. And then we had the Labour Party conference, where it seemed that the most headline-grabbing event was Keir Starmer had glitter thrown all over him by a protester, although nobody seemed perfectly clear on what the protester was protesting about. There was no snappy line that he had. He had this long, rambly speech as he was dragged away. A few people commenting that when Keir Starmer had this glitter thrown all over his dark suit, and he took off the suit jacket, a few people said it looked rehearsed somehow. So if you're wondering, I can confirm that every day when I put on a suit jacket, I do actually take it off. So if ever there's an event where I need to take off my jacket, that taking the jacket off is actually rehearsed. In fact, I've been rehearsing taking off my jacket ever since I wore, the school blazer for school. So I guess you could say I've been rehearsing taking off the suit jacket for decades. So I hope if the opportunity ever arises that I pull it off and that it looks good and I take off a jacket sensibly. So yeah, that's what the that's what the silly season is all about. These ridiculous news items. If I pick up, my favourite publication, which is Private Eye. Then looking back earlier in the season, say late September, then we've got articles about dangerous dogs. The government considering putting down and banning certain types of dangerous dogs. That hasn't really been a news story since the 90s when John Major was Prime Minister. So interesting to see that ridiculous story coming forward. And we have Russell Brand, who again, about a decade or more ago, kind of became a big public personality with, sex, drugs, and stand-up comedy. And it turns out that his history is not entirely squeaky clean. So there's quite a scandal over that. Lawrence Fox, some kind of political commentator, also said something horrible but also unsurprising. So there's a big media furore over that. So as you can see, a lot of the stories are relatively silly. There are still questions, again going back to late September, about working from home. Lots of companies want people to come back, and the government is no exception as a major employer. And there have been stories about whether British spies can actually do some of their work from home. So Private Eye naturally has the updated top 10 Bond movies, Dr. no internet today, so sorry I can't do anything, on Her Majesty's secret sofa, You Only Open the Fridge Twice an Hour, The Spy Who Loved Countdown, Fewer Eyes and Anyone Else in the House Only, Zoom Taker, good, License to Kill Time, that's pretty good, Online Casino Royale, No Time to Work, and Lie in Another Day. And underneath it, the editor's note, that's enough films, you're all sacked. So, I've always thought that the silly season was a relatively modern concept, but, well, normally I'd look at the Encyclopedia Britannica or something like that, but here, Wikipedia actually just reprints a big section from the Oxford English Dictionary, which reveals that the silly season was first talked about in 1861, saying, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia, which says to be quoting from the OED, during the months of summer, when Parliament is no longer sitting and the gay world is no longer gathered together in London, something very different is supposed to do for the remnant of the public from what is needed in the politer portions of the year. The times as great men have doubtless gone out of town like other great men. The hands which at other times wield the pen for our instruction are now wielding the gun on a Scotch moor or the alpenstock on a Swiss mountain. Work is left to feebler hands. In those months, the great oracle becomes what at other times it is not, simply silly. In spring and early summer, the Times newspaper is often violent, unfair, fallacious, inconsistent, intentionally unmeaning, even positively blundering, but it is very seldom merely silly. In the dead of autumn, when the second and third-rate hands are on, we sink from the nonsense written with a purpose to nonsense written because the writer must write either nonsense or nothing. So, we have good reasons to have very, very silly news. Of course, there still is news. Local news carries on, but of course, what happens here in West Yorkshire does not generally affect what's going on in Hampshire. What's going on in Dover doesn't really affect what's going on in Northumbria. So, naturally, the local newspapers is where it's at. What we do have are those politicians in London coming up, hopefully, to connect with the general public. So I was at a dinner a few days ago at which there were several local MPs and they were being addressed by Michael Gove. I posted this on my Instagram. Naturally, there are some very, very thought-through political opinions being commented underneath. But he's been a government minister, Michael Gove, for 12 of the last 13 years, serving 4 of the last 5 prime ministers. So, very interested in what he had to say. He gave a speech that was, of course, very good. You kind of expect that from somebody who's been at the front line of politics for so long, a cabinet minister for so long. But actually what I was most interested in is he had about an hour for question and answer. And here in Yorkshire, where people say what they mean and mean what they say, people had some very forthright questions about global affairs, about taxation rates, corporation tax, inheritance tax and so on, and some local policies about Bradford City Council having authority over some of the town councils here, whether it was on the grand international stage or it was the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life here. He actually responded to that very, very well, and you could see why he was, well, at the top of his profession. Regardless of whatever your view might be, and I'm aware that many people do have views. I haven't really responded to most of them that have been commented on my Instagram, because if they're deeply thought through political views, well, I can't match it, and if it's not a deeply thought view, well, what's the point? But one person did ask if I had asked a question about his favourite Bond film, and I can confirm, no, I didn't. It wasn't that kind of event. But I think it was great to connect with the local members of Parliament. So I had Natter to one of my locals. I've talked to another previously, and I think it's very good to go. I think British politics is unusually accessible. So, for example, I've seen the man who's currently president of Turkey. I've actually been to one of his speeches, and of course that was heavily securitized. This was a relatively informal, relaxed meeting, and as I say, it's very easy to meet your local MP here one-to-one. I've done it a number of times, and I think it's very important, because what you ultimately come away with, or rather what I ultimately come away with, is the feeling that, well, they're just people. they're just people. Let's put this in movie terms.
We're not so different, you and I, Lieutenant.
We are not so different, you and I.
If you would
this, you'd see that you and I, we're really not so very different.
Maybe you are right. Maybe you and I are not so different.
Then they're not so different from a Saxon after all.
It made me realize we're not so different.
Your methods are not different as much as you pretend.
So we're not so different after all.
Hermano, you and me, we're not so different.
You're an amazing creature, Spider-Man. You and I are not so different.
You were the one who led them to their deaths. You see, we're not that different, are we?
Well, there we go. There's my splendid insight. We're not so different. Let's have a quick look at the local newspapers. First of all, I'm having a look at the Craven, Herald and Pioneer. This is from the Thursday, September the 28th. So I've been collecting these, looking through them. One of them is thousands give warm welcome to the new bishop for Craven area. And it's a lady bishop, Anne Eltringham. She's now the Bishop of Ripon. Craven has a new bishop following the departure earlier this year of Dr. Helen Ann Hartley. So there we go, two lady bishops in a row. Dr. Helen left the district to become Bishop of Newcastle, and the new Bishop of Ripon, which includes Craven, Reverend Canon Anna Eltringham, was welcomed, among others, at Ripon Cathedral in front of an audience of civic leaders which included the Mayor of Skippon, Councillor Sheila Bentley. Here, the Very Reverend John Dobson, the Dean of Ripon, reflects on a busy weekend of events at the cathedral. The article, of course, continues. Very interesting, not only that we have a lady bishop, but also in the lineup of key members of clergy we have 5 women and 4 men. Of course, women were allowed to become vicars in the Church of England in the 90s, and we had what was then a fairly topical sitcom, The Vicar of Dibley, which was based upon it. It's a rural village which is shocked to the core to receive a lady as their vicar. Of course, the Church of England is our state church. The head of the Church of England is the king, and when a new bishop comes in, as it says here, you'll have the mayor in attendance. I described earlier in the year, I think, the legal service. So if you're part of the police, part of the judiciary, you have to come to one of these services once a year, and they're specially arranged for them. They're very, very interesting. Anyway, interesting on that, and I've just been watching a little documentary on YouTube about the attempt to create an American vicar of Dibley, which actually didn't look too bad. They only made the test pilot, but actually looked decent. And I think perhaps not fully adapted to American sensibilities, where, you know, there's not an established church. I did 2 episodes on that earlier in this year, I think. So one of them was an interview with Canon Ned Lunn, and I got an email about that very, very recently, someone saying how much they enjoyed it, but I know when it came out, the sound quality wasn't great if you were, say, driving along, because I actually recorded it in the cathedral, and that corner where I recorded it happened to be very, very echoey. Too much was going on in the less echoey room, so I couldn't grab another location. However, I then did, I think the next week, one called What is a Church of England Service, which sets out, you know, blow by blow what happens on a Sunday morning. So hopefully that would have been more enjoyable to those who weren't able to listen to the first one, because it was very much drawing on the research there. Anyway, as I go through the local newspapers, we also have the nostalgia section, and I found that very interesting. It's a local historian. One of them, this one from the Craven Herald, is about the extraordinary life of a soldier who was town's first victim of the Great War. The writer is Robin Longbottom, and this is one that I'd quite like to read out in full. In February 1915, Ben Hodgson had the unfortunate distinction of being the first soldier from Silsden to be killed in the Great War. He had been a colourful character in the town, and well known for his thirst for adventure. Ben was born in Shipley in 1877, and after moving several times, his family finally settled in Silsden in the early 1890s. He first attained notoriety aged 16. In June 1894, he had slept over with a friend, Marmaduke Dawson. While rummaging through a drawer, they came across £12 10 shillings and a cheque for £5 15 shillings belonging to Marmaduke's father. The next morning, Ben took the money and fled for Liverpool. On arrival, he cashed the cheque and bought a new suit, pocket watch and chain and a ticket on the SS Ohio bound for New York. However, the police were hot on his trail and detained him as he was about to board the ship. He appeared before Skipton magistrate courts a few days later. His solicitor blamed the actions on wild tales of fiction he had read in penny novels. Nevertheless, he was sentenced to 3 months in prison. In September 1895, he married Anne Tillotson. They settled with her widowed mother, and a son, Willie, was born the following year. However, after 2 years of marriage, he left his wife and joined the Duke of Wellington's regiment. His attestation describes him as 5'3", with blue eyes and brown hair, and on his left forearm he had a tattoo of a cross with the letters AT and BH and the word love. After a little over a month, he was claimed by the parish authorities for wife desertion and discharged. Later the same year, he took off a second time and joined the Gordon Highlanders. When the Second Boer War broke out in 1899, the regiment sailed to South Africa. The Gordons were involved in several engagements against the Boers, and in 1900, Ben was wounded and invalided back to England. After recovering, he learned that he would be returning to South Africa, but decided he would rather face his wife and the authorities in Silverstone than the Boers once again. So, he wrote to tell his wife of his whereabouts. She notified the authorities, and they contacted the regiment, and he was discharged for deserting his family. Ben now settled down and led an uneventful life until 2 new police constables, Cook and Henthorne, were appointed in Silverstone. Their heavy-handed approach to policing soon made them unpopular, and late one night Cook was set upon and given a beating. A short while later, on April the 4th, 1911, Henthorne was also beaten up. However, he claimed to be able to identify 2 of the assailants, one of whom he said was Ben Hodgson. The Skipton magistrates acquitted the second man, but despite witnesses providing an alibi for Ben, he was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months in prison. 4 nights later, a mob, incensed by the injustice, attacked Silverstone police station and broke all the windows. Order was eventually restored, and both Cook and Henshaw were subsequently transferred to other divisions. When war broke out, in 1914, Ben left his family once again and joined the Duke of Wellington's regiment, but having been kicked out once, he signed up under the alias Ben Harrison. With his previous military experience, he was immediately sent out to join the 2nd Battalion on the Ypres salient in Belgium. He was killed by shrapnel on February the 23rd, 1915, and with no known grave is remembered on the Menin Gate under his alias Ben Harrison. A life of adventure. Incidentally, that war in against the Boers is the one that my grandfather's grandfather joined the British Army in order to join when he was 13. He joined as a drummer boy. And I talked about that in one of my YouTube videos. I think the one about 3 generations in Cyprus. And of course, he did a 30-minute documentary on the British in Cyprus, I think just 1 month ago. Thank you to all the kind remarks I received as a result of that. I do find this history interesting, although I do keep saying that I am not actually a historian. So, I'm just having a quick look through Keighley News, again from just late September. I had a few of these old newspapers hanging around because I've been collecting these for a while, just looking out for interesting and unusual news stories. One of them was a waterfall, which is up for sale. Goit Stock Waterfall, part of the woodland site that is up for sale. And it's a notable waterfall, not particularly huge, but very particularly beautiful. A beauty spot is up for sale and could be yours for around £350,000. Not excessive. Goit Stock Wood, which covers an area of almost 70 acres near Cullingworth, has been put on the market. The site, a well-loved attraction with the public, includes the 20-foot-high Goit Stock Waterfall. Current owners, Paul and Julie Davis, are selling the woodland as they look ahead towards their retirement. Paul says, "We have owned Goit Stock Wood for 20 years and have made some fantastic memories there, but the time has now come for us to sell the woods and give someone else the opportunity to own a much cherished part of our local history." Fascinating. There's a few other nature notes, one that I cannot resist looking at. Nature Notes by Anne Clark, Wharfdale Naturalist Society. Some people return from their holidays with fridge magnets, suntans and photos. I return with bones, botanical curiosities and bits of glass. Sometimes I discover it may have been illegal to bring these objects back in one's luggage, and I am not advocating ignorant importation of dangerous materials. It is useful to check regulations before you try stuffing something interesting into the bottom of your luggage. Having got that out of the way, etc., etc., etc. She talks about collecting, skulls, bones, sea pods, shells, pine cones, and so on. Current favourite holiday find is the razorbill skull from a St Andrew's beach, which was my gift to stay-at-home partner in lieu of printed rock or a tartan hat. Just a quick note to anyone considering giving me a gift. I would prefer a tartan hat to a skull, and I'd be interested to know which one you would prefer. You can, of course, email me at albionneverdies and contact me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies. There's also a few just lovely photos being printed, of course, of Goitstock, the waterfall and so on, naturally tying in with the front page, but also of the steam train, the Scarborough Spa Express. If you wanted to take a steam train to a spa, well, you have the opportunity here. Having looked through another Keighley newspaper, and again another bit of local news. Most of this, the newspaper is full of stories such as raising money for charity. Pensioners' Tea Party was able to raise about £800 for one local charity. There were some show events, vegetable shows and auctions for heifers, lambs, things like that. One of them is interesting. Invitation to adopted country. So Ryan Ettenfield and his wife Niloufar. Uzbekistan is probably not a country that many Keighley people would be familiar with, but one man from town is striving to put the Central Asian nation firmly on the tourism map. Ryan Ettenfield, quote, ended up, end quote, in Uzbekistan whilst travelling, like the use of the quote marks there, and settled there after meeting his now wife. After realising how little information was available to visitors to the country, he's launched a travel website, tourcentralasia.com. He says, I was travelling for 6 months before the COVID pandemic and ended up in Uzbekistan. Initially, I was here for a few months as I couldn't manage to book a flight out, but in the meantime, I met Niloufar and now we're married with a 3-month-old baby. The website was inspired by a lack of up-to-date resources for tourism in Uzbekistan. So he's talking about trying to pull out his friends and families to visit Uzbekistan. I guess it's not so well known, although I have watched their television, since as a Turkish speaker, their language is relatively understandable, perhaps comparable to Spanish and Italian, except with Uzbekistan it's useful to learn a bit of Russian as well, to spatter in those words in amongst the Turkish. There's one more piece of historical news that I found just really interesting. It does read like a novel or a TV show, but again it's by local historian Robin Longbottom, this time for Keighley News. Last time his article was for the Craven. I guess he's syndicated, which is fantastic, but I thought this was a really interesting one, so I will simply read it out. Textile heir fell for panto in love affair that brought intrigue. In 1958, Queen Elizabeth II abolished the annual ceremony of presenting debutantes at court. At the event, young women were introduced into society for the first time. Whilst the aristocracy paraded before the monarch, other smaller events for the gentry and wealthier classes took place at balls throughout the country. The tradition had begun in the late 18th century and was the first step to finding daughters and a suitable husband and of ensuring that sons married well. It is the theme of many period novels and was epitomised in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. At these occasions, parents colluded to introduce their sons and daughters to one another, hoping to secure advantageous marriages. If a match was made, Marriage settlements were agreed in which money and property were placed in trust to give financial support to the couple. In the Keighley district, the daughters of the gentry and wealthy industrial classes also went through the process, and by the end of the late 19th century, most of the leading families, such as Sugden, Haggis, Blakely and Hattersley, were related to one another by marriage. Marriages acceptable within a social class were not always accomplished, and scandals were inevitable, most notably that of Edward VIII, who gave up his kingdom to marry Wallis Simpson. Less well known is the marriage of Billy Cavendish, the eldest son of the Duke of Devonshire, to the American socialite Kathleen Kennedy, eldest sister of John F. Kennedy, future President of America. The union caused eruptions on both sides of the Atlantic because the Devonshires were Protestants and the Kennedys were Catholics. The Keighley area was not immune from its own marital dramas. The most controversial occurred 30 years before Edward VIII abdicated, and it rocked the Merrill family in Haworth. The Merrills owned Ebor and Lees Mills and had been worsted spinners and manufacturers for 3 generations. In 1900, the head of the family was Edwin Merrill, who lived at Longlands on the outskirts of the village. When he died suddenly in 1904, his eldest son, Charles Edwin, known as Charlie, was expected to step into the business. Charlie had been educated at private school, but now, in his early 20s, showed little inclination towards taking on the responsibilities. Quite the contrary. He spent his time at music halls and theatres and dining with his friends. He also bought himself an open-tourer motor car and quickly attained notoriety after being clocked several times by the police for exceeding the speed limit. In December 1906, he became infatuated with Miss Lily Langdon, who played Princess Prettysing in the pantomime Robinson Crusoe at the Theatre Royal in Bradford. The couple were soon linked romantically, and during the 8-week performance, his motor car was regularly seen outside the theatre. Miss Langdon, whose real name was Mona Marjorie Muriel Deacon, was Canadian by birth and had been touring the country in theatre productions over the last 2 years. It was a whirlwind romance, and within days of the performance closing, Charlie obtained a special licence and the couple were married at Bradford Registry Office in March 1907. No members of his family attended, and his attempt to keep the marriage secret failed. The press reported that the groom, dressed in his motoring outfit, Norfolk jacket, knickerbockers and gaiters, left the ceremony with his wife under a shower of confetti and later that day set off for a honeymoon in France. On their return to England, the couple set up home in Shipley, but they later moved to the south of England. During the Great War, he served as a private in the Army Service Corps and afterwards disappeared into obscurity. He never reconciled with his family and is said to have died penniless in 1934. I have to say, the picture of him in his open-tourer motor car looks very, very grand. He failed to mention his top hat, and whilst it says that he was done for speeding, it looks very much like he was prodding his driver to speed rather than speeding himself. Well, those are all my silly stories. I hope that you enjoyed them. Thank you to the people who've recently signed up to my newsletter, The Red Vesper, Mark from Bulgaria, good to hear from you again, Christopher, John, Patrick and Roger. I send out these personal letters about once a month, so I hope it's not too much. I hope you enjoy it. And of course, frequently I'll enter those names into a lucky draw and send out some kind of prize for one of the alphabet of Britishness mugs. A is for Albion, B is for Bloody Hell, and all those things. I've sent out one to an English teacher in Korea, I've sent one out to a medical student in India, and I've sent a few to North America. So if you carry on doing those draws, if you're interested in signing up, the link is in the show notes, and it's also the link is on my bio and Instagram and so on. Or you can just message me, just send me an email at albionneverdies@gmail.com and I'll just sign you up. Message me any way you can, I'll sign you up. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed those silly stories. I very much enjoyed meeting my local MPs, going through my local newspapers. I do like local news. I hope you enjoyed it too. Goodbye.